Dr. Marcus Webb was assigned to what his supervisors described as cultural observation and welfare monitoring on the Valtheran Research Station Threshold Alpha, a posting that involved checking on the well-being of Princess Lyra Nethara, who had been living in isolated quarters on the station for 3 years. The assignment briefing was deliberately vague about why a member of Valtheran royalty was living on a research station rather than at the imperial court. But Marcus pieced together from careful reading that Lyra had some kind of medical or psychological condition that made her presence at court complicated. The briefing materials described Lyra as medically fragile and psychologically delicate, suggesting she required minimal stimulation and controlled environmental conditions. They made clear that Marcus's observations should be conducted remotely through monitoring systems rather than direct interaction unless absolutely necessary. The entire situation had the feel of someone being hidden away because their existence was inconvenient. When Marcus actually reviewed the monitoring data from Lyra's quarters, he found someone who didn't match the briefing descriptions. She wasn't catatonic or unresponsive. She read voraciously, engaged with complex scientific materials, maintained detailed journals suggesting active intellectual engagement rather than psychological fragility. What she was, clearly, was profoundly isolated. Alone in quarters that were comfortable but sterile, with no visitors, no meaningful social interaction, nothing except books and educational materials, and the kind of supervised isolation that started to look less like medical necessity and more like imprisonment disguised as protection. Marcus's first direct interaction with Lyra happened when he decided that welfare monitoring should probably include actually talking to the person he was supposed to be monitoring. He requested permission to visit her quarters, received reluctant approval with multiple warnings about not overwhelming her with excessive stimulation, and entered expecting to find someone matching the briefing descriptions. Instead, he found a young Valtheran woman who looked up from her book with an expression of surprised hope that immediately made him question everything he'd been told. "You're the human observer," Lyra said, her voice quiet but clear, lacking any of the psychological fragility the briefings suggested. "I was told someone would be checking that my conditions are adequate. I didn't expect you'd actually visit." There was something in how she said it, the surprise that anyone would bother with direct interaction, that made Marcus realize she'd been profoundly isolated. "I'm Marcus Webb. I'm assigned to monitor your well-being, and it seemed like talking to you directly would be more effective than just reviewing data logs." He kept his voice gentle, still uncertain about her actual medical situation, but increasingly confident that whatever was keeping her isolated wasn't making her unable to have normal conversation. "May I ask you some questions?" Lyra gestured for him to sit, and what followed was a conversation that completely contradicted the briefing materials. She was articulate, intellectually engaged, curious about human culture in ways suggesting she'd been starved for new information and perspectives. She was also clearly lonely, not in the sense of being emotionally fragile, but in the straightforward sense of someone who'd been isolated from meaningful social contact for years and desperately wanted connection. When Marcus carefully asked about her medical condition, trying to understand what actually necessitated this isolation, Lyra's response was matter-of-fact. "I'm autistic by human terminology, which Valtheran culture describes as being star-touched. I have sensory sensitivities, and I process social interaction differently than neurotypical Valtheran. The imperial court decided that made me unsuitable for public life and potentially dangerous to expose to complex social situations, so they sent me here for medical observation. That's functionally indefinite isolated confinement." She said it without self-pity, just stating facts. "I'm not medically fragile. I'm neurodivergent, and my family decided that was easier to handle by hiding me away than by accommodating my actual needs." Marcus processed this with growing anger. "They told me you required minimal stimulation and controlled conditions for your psychological well-being, that you were too delicate for normal social interaction. They told you I'm fragile because admitting I'm just different would require acknowledging that isolation isn't medical necessity, it's convenience. It's easier to keep me hidden than to make the imperial court accessible to someone who experiences social interaction differently than tradition expects." Over the following weeks, Marcus continued visiting Lyra regularly, justifying it as necessary for thorough well-being monitoring, while becoming increasingly convinced that her isolation was unjust confinement. Their conversations revealed someone curious, insightful, and entirely capable of engaging with the world when her sensory and communication needs were respected. Lyra asked endless questions about human culture, about Marcus's life, about the station beyond her quarters that she'd been prevented from accessing. She was gentle in her curiosity, never demanding, always respectful of boundaries, but clearly hungry for connection and information that 3 years of isolation had denied her. What surprised Marcus was how her presence affected him. He'd never been particularly brave about challenging authority. His career had been built on following protocols and not making waves. But watching Lyra's quiet trust, her willingness to share despite years of being dismissed as too fragile, that awakened something in him. Her delicate curiosity about the world she'd been denied made him angry on her behalf in ways that translated into courage he didn't know he had. When Lyra mentioned that she'd never seen the station's observation deck, the beautiful viewport overlooking the nebula that made Threshold Alpha famous, because her isolation protocols didn't permit access to public areas, Marcus made a decision. Would you like to see it, the observation deck, if I arranged authorization? Lyra looked at him with an expression that cycled through hope, skepticism, and careful caution about believing something good might happen. They won't authorize that. I'm supposed to remain in isolated quarters to avoid overwhelming social stimulation and to prevent complications. Complications meaning that people might see you and remember that you exist, that they might have to acknowledge that the princess they've hidden away is actually a person who deserves more than solitary confinement disguised as medical care. Marcus's voice carried more heat than he intended, but he didn't take it back. I think you deserve to see the observation deck. And I think the protocols keeping you isolated are unjust. So I'm going to request authorization, and if they refuse, I'm going to escalate until someone has to explicitly admit they're keeping you confined for social convenience rather than medical necessity. Marcus's request for authorization was initially denied with vague citations about medical protocols and psychological risk assessments. So he escalated, demanding actual medical justification, pointing out that his welfare monitoring role required him to advocate for his assigned subjects' well-being, and that indefinite social isolation causes documented psychological harm. His formal report questioning the medical and ethical basis for Lyra's confinement forced a review that revealed what he suspected. There was no legitimate medical reason for her isolation beyond her family's discomfort with her neurodivergence and the imperial court's preference for keeping her hidden. The review concluded that Lyra should be permitted supervised access to station facilities as long as her sensory needs were accommodated. When Marcus told Lyra, her response was quiet gratitude mixed with visible anxiety. What if I can't handle it? What if the sensory input is too much, and I have a meltdown in public and prove everyone right about me being too fragile? Then we'll handle it, Marcus said simply. We'll plan for your sensory needs. We'll go during quiet hours when the deck isn't crowded, and if you need to leave, we leave. Having access to reasonable accommodations doesn't make you fragile. It makes you someone whose different neurology requires different support, which is completely normal. Their visit to the observation deck was carefully planned for minimal crowds and maximum sensory accommodation. When Lyra saw the nebula through the viewport, colors she'd only read about, vastness she'd been denied for years, her expression was wonder mixed with quiet tears that she didn't try to hide. Thank you, she told Marcus. Not just for bringing me here, but for believing I deserve to be brought here. For having the courage to challenge protocols that everyone else just accepted because questioning them was inconvenient. You gave me that courage, Marcus admitted. Watching your curiosity about a world you'd been denied, your trust despite years of people dismissing you as too delicate, that made me brave enough to fight for you when I'm usually someone who just follows protocols without question. Over the following months, Lyra gained increasing access to station facilities, her presence forcing staff to confront that the isolated princess they'd been told was too fragile was actually just someone whose needs required accommodation rather than confinement. Marcus continued advocating for her integration into station life. And their relationship developed from observer and subject into genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and recognition that her delicate trust gave him courage, while his willingness to fight gave her freedom. Years later, when Lyra had returned to active life at the imperial court, with accommodations for her sensory needs and communication differences that Marcus helped establish protocols for, she described their relationship's impact. I was hidden away because people decided that being different made me too delicate for normal life. That isolation was kinder than accommodation. Marcus saw past that to recognize I wasn't fragile, I was confined. His courage to challenge systems everyone else accepted gave me access to the world I'd been denied. But he says I gave him that courage first, through trust and curiosity that made him brave enough to fight rather than just observe. Marcus's version emphasized different aspects. She was isolated because her family and culture decided that neurodivergence was something to hide rather than accommodate. But watching her gentle curiosity about a world she'd been denied, her willingness to trust despite years of dismissal, that gave me courage I didn't know I had. Sometimes it's not strength or authority that brings change, but someone's delicate presence that makes you brave enough to challenge injustice you'd otherwise have accepted. She made me courageous by trusting that I could be, and I gave her freedom by refusing to accept that confinement was appropriate care. The story of the hidden princess and the human observer who brought her into the light became example of how trust empowers courage, how delicate presence